Hello there, and welcome to this little presentation I've got here. So I'm going to be talking about airliners, how they work. I'm going to use something called Flight Radar 24 to illustrate what that is and how that works. I'm also going to talk about a plane crash. But the whole purpose for this little thing is just an additional thing for Christina Blackfeather. Christina Blackfeather is an American, because bear in mind that not everybody who's watching this or will be watching this later are in from the Great Debate community. I have a lot of people who watch from the cycle camera stuff and a couple of other bits. So, you know, my audience is a little bit varied here and there. Anyway, so for those people who don't know and people who may not be American, the American healthcare system is great in some ways, but kind of awful in others. And one of my friends, Christina Blackfeather, she's had to have some surgery. And the healthcare system, a bit like car insurance, you have something called an excess. So you've got to pay the first £300 or whatever would be an equivalent of. And that stops people from claiming on their insurance for a cracked windscreen or something minor, you know, a bumper gets scraped. So she has $7,000 of that. Plus, she's got to be off work for weeks and got to pay the rent and, you know, things like that. So it's had a direct impact on her. So beneath the video here in the description, there's, you know, there's a fundraiser to help Christina. And so if you can give to that, you know, I and she would be, you know, would be very pleased. So give what you can, give whenever you can. That would be wonderful. So I'm going to talk about a website that I use. So I like watching planes. And I use this website called Flight Radar 24. I'm going to show it you here. And it uses radar effectively. So what happens is the company behind them, you can get a box which receives radio signals, and you plug it into your computer with a USB, and that contacts their server, you know, and basically pumps out what you're seeing now. So all these planes here. So what happens when you've got a plane? It constantly sends out a signal. It's a transponder, it's called. It sends out a signal and it tells the air traffic controllers what its altitude is, what its course heading is, what the speed is. And all these things they need to know to be able to make sure they don't have crash. I mean, if you look, we've got two aircraft here that are heading on a similar angle here. If this one's going faster, they could collide. But if I click on this one here, which is a British Airways 777, it tells you the registration there, and it tells you it's at 38,000 feet. Its course is 161 degrees, and it's traveling at 506 knots, which is 582 miles an hour. So whereas this one here is traveling at 36,000 feet, so it's 2,000 feet below it, and that's a 767. Gives the registration again. That's going at 100 degrees. And it tells you that it's going from Washington, D.C. to Amsterdam, as opposed to this one here, which is going from Seattle to London. And if I zoom out, it actually draws the trace of the angle it followed all the way there. And of course, when you can see how many planes there are right now. And this, you can kind of see this stream going across the middle there, but there's also quite a lot going over the top here. Now, something to bear in mind here, the shape of the Earth's surface means that these are going in pretty much a straight line. If I was to bring up Google Earth or something, you'd be able to see and draw a line, and it would follow right along that track. Now, if we look at the colors, so the colors represent the altitude. So where this is low altitude and it's getting higher and higher, and then gradually it goes purple. And you can actually drag this or maybe not drag it, but you can when it's finished its flight, and you can follow it along. Now, the other thing here is, if you notice, you can see how these lines are dotted. Dotted lines means this is a place where there's no radar coverage. Basically, I don't know if anyone, I don't know how many of you ever flown over this. I did a month or so ago when I went to San Francisco. But this data relies on someone living here to be able to pick up the signal from the transponder. And so what they've done is they dot it to give a suggestion of where they'll be. This one would be, in the middle of that dotted line. So you generally know what direction they'll be traveling. Now, so the nice thing about this website is that you can anticipate what's going to happen. So, for example, when I was going to San Francisco, I knew which plane I would be getting on 8 hours before it got to to Manchester, where I was getting on the plane, because when you click on a flight, so let's just take this British Airways plane here. So this is an Airbus A380, big jumbo thing. So if I chuck in the flight number there, see BA 282. So if I put that in the search here, and that's the one that's today's, will that search that one? No, that'll look at the direct one. Oop, excuse me, wrong way. Let's try again. So we can look at what its previous flights were, and you can see the aircraft that flew on that flight. And frequently, it will tell you what the service will be hours before it is that. And you can find this out by going to your airport. So right now it's nighttime. You can see that these are the day parts there. This is the nighttime bit here. So let's go to the Far East, where it's an okay time. So let's have a look let's go to Japan. So this is Narita Airport, which is Tokyo's main airport. And if we click on here, it will load up all the different flights that are going to, that are going to take off later. So you've got arrivals and departures. So if I go for departures, imagine I'm going to be on, I'm going to go, let's have a look for this. Let's say, that looks good. Detroit, there we go. So if I click on Detroit, this Detroit flight, it will give, let's have a look. No, it doesn't have the, it only has the aircraft type. So it only has the flight number. Let's have a look, what's this one? No, sometimes it has the aircraft on it, but this website is really useful because you can be watching for your plane coming in at the airport, and rather than sitting around just waiting for someone to call, you can use it to find where the when the aircraft comes in, and then you can watch it come in and taxi and dock at a gate, at which point you can basically say, right, okay, that's going to be my plane because that plane's going to where I'm going, and then be able to sort of sit near the gate, and instead of ending up, you know, standing up and squeezing next to someone, you can get a nice seat next to the window, or, you know, not wherever you want. So now there's a couple of things that's interesting about this, because if you notice, there are some parts of the world where you don't get very many planes. It's not that the planes aren't necessarily there, but the coverage isn't there. So if you look at Africa, a lot of places where people don't have the internet, so they don't have these transponder receivers, and so, you know, there's not much there. And you may end up with chunks which are all dotted. Another thing to notice is how Syria and Iraq don't have many planes going over them. That's because it's been a bit of a war zone. And, you know, when you get wars going on, people tend to avoid things like that. And look, here's another section, the Ukraine. And if you remember, there was a, what was the airline? Malaysian Airlines plane that was shot down. As a result, you know, they're staying away from that area, especially on the eastern side here, which is where that little civil war thing's been going on there. So, yeah. The other thing you can see is that there are corridors that flow down from certain directions. So, and funnily enough, this will lead to something I'll be mentioning later. So there are two ways to get to the UK from the US. One of them is to go kind of straightish across the Atlantic, and you can see how many aircraft are flying in right now. At the moment, if you can see my clock down the bottom corner, it's 5:49 in the morning, so it's nearly 10 to 6 in the morning. And you get a lot of flights that leave the US at like 9 o'clock at night and things like that. They're overnight flights. So this one was a 11 o'clock departure, you know, so they're overnight flights. You get to sleep on the plane, if you can sleep on a plane. I'm not very good at it. But you can see again, 2153, you know, and oh, that's a cargo plane, this one. This is a 747 freighter. Fairly new one, actually. It's an 800. And like I say, you can see the registration. And also there are other websites you can look at. I use this one here, Air Fleets. So if I was to look up so you can look up, this is the entire British Airways fleet. So let's pick, let's find, that's KLM. There's a British Airways A380. So this is GXLEF. So if we look here, Airbus A380, and we can open up a new window. So XLEF. And if we click on that, we can tell there's the registration. So the registration is basically like your the license plate number, except for this stays with the aircraft sort of for the life of it. When a plane gets transferred from one country to another, they can re-register it, but effectively what happens is they have these registrations, so they get an equal amount of maintenance. Because the last thing that you want is one plane that's had, you know, 8,000 hours and hasn't had a service, and another one that's had 2,000 hours and hasn't between his service. You want to make sure that they all have the same amount of service time, so you know they don't break. So it's an Airbus A380-800, British Airways is the flight. It was delivered in May 2014. The configuration, which is basically how the seats are arranged. It's got 4 Trent 900 engines. And there was something funny on the news when this was first introduced, when the news said it had 900 Trent engines. Not quite the same thing. And then it shows the route that it was delivered from. So from Toulouse to I don't even know how to pronounce that, to Heathrow. So yeah, we can also look up an older aircraft. So let's have a look at one of their 747s. So let's have a look at this. Let's take this one here. So that's 28 years old, nearly 30 years old. That plane has been flying. It's a 747-400. It was delivered in May 1990. Again, the configuration. Some Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, and it was reconfigured. So they've changed the seating in 2015. This is the kind of thing where they may have, in the first class section, they'll have those flat roll-down beds, things like that. So yeah, things like that. No town drunk, you can't see chemtrails on the flight tracker because chemtrails are contrails. Yeah. So yeah, things like, you can look at individual aircraft and see how old it is. You get other aircraft that move around a lot. I mean, generally bigger airlines like this, they will, move things. They will keep the planes for their lifetime. So let me present that. There you go. So I'm a bit sad. I watch the planes. I watch them come in to take off and land. It's something to do. Looking out the window. We just take a drink. I just spent a couple of hours playing Drunk Bears, and I've been laughing, so my throat is a bit dry. But you can see there are so many planes that fly across this route, and they're almost all going this way at the moment, because the daytime flights fly off at sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon UK time. But we've got one here. So this is a UPS freighter. I'm actually curious about this one. Let's have a look. Let's copy the registration and go back to Airfleet. So let's look up this one. Okay, it was delivered new like that. I was hoping it might be one of those aircraft that was refurbished. But this is a Turkish Airlines. Is it? Oh no, sorry, I'm not. Come on, load up. It is Turkish Airlines. A330 going to Havana. Oh, little Gulfstream type thing there. WestJet in Canada. Even find something good. That's a Virgin 747 going to Glasgow. I didn't even know they went to Glasgow. Oh, there we go. Flight from Las Vegas to Manchester. Now let's put that one in. So let's do a search on that one. Okay. You remember I was saying earlier about how sometimes you can anticipate? So imagine I'm going to Cancun later on. So that's later today. It leaves at 10:35 UK time. So imagine I want to get on that plane today. Now, I know where that plane is now. We saw it a few moments ago flying across the Atlantic. So you can, and there it is coming in from Las Vegas. It's expected to get here at 2:21. And was it 8? No, sorry, it's not. It's 8:38. Okay. Oh yeah, sorry, the time based upon where it was. Anyway, so 8:35 because it's estimated time. That's it. Scheduled time of arrival. What was this one? Actual departure. Of course it is. Yeah. So sometimes planes get delayed. So this one was due to leave at 14:35. Actually left a bit early. You know, they managed to get everyone on the plane. And something to bear in mind that when airports are complicated things, effectively planes they get kind of like a license to land there, so they have to pay money, you know, for the slot, and the slot is the time to land, to taxi to the gate, to unload passengers, to load passengers, to taxi out, and to go away, to fly out, take off again. And when it comes to planes, when it comes to you know, the aviation industry, any time that a plane is on the ground, any time that it's not flying and in service, it's wasting money. They constantly use these. I mean, you look at this, just this individual plane. You know, it's flying constantly. You know, it lands. Let's have a look. It's supposed to take off at that time, landed at that time, and then took off again a couple of hours later, and then took off. You know, so 2 hours. It's got 2 hours between hitting the floor and arriving at the airport and taking off again and going somewhere else. And then when it gets to there, 2 hours. And so when you get a flight delay, usually it's because it was delayed taking off somewhere else. And some airports, somewhere like Newark or something like that, they have such delays that they write them into the timetable knowing that they'll be delayed. So, yeah, this gives an idea. So if I was going to Cancun, I can look at where this plane is now. I can see what the registration will be. And then I can figure out, you know, because you can look on the Manchester, you know, on the, if I was to click on Manchester, so let's do that. So if I look at Manchester, so we've got, what time was it supposed to depart? Supposed to depart 10:35. Get rid of that. Okay, so departures. Let's have a look. Load later flights. So there's our flight to Cancun, and it tells you there's the flight number, and it tells you what the plane's going to be. So MDBD. So what you can do is when you get to the airport, you can look out the window, you know, because you can walk down the gates once you're airside. You can look out, and all you have to do is look at the plane registration, and you'll be able to tell which plane it's, you know, which your plane is going to be, and so you can park yourself where the plane is, knowing that all these other people that are sat, you know, having a you know, a coffee, and you can be sat there with your coffee, but all these people that, you know, you might have 300 people that end up, or 250 people get on that plane with you. And so all those people are not going to be able to fit in all the seats that are available. So you've already got yourself a seat before you've even got, you know, before they've even called the gate number. You already know where which your plane is going to be. I did that when I went to San Francisco. So like I say, it's useful in that way. So now, another thing to bear in mind with a plane is its lifespan. The lifespan of a plane is about 20 years, 30 years, something like that. And it really comes down to the plane type and how the routes that it's doing. So, for example, a plane like this is a long distance one. So it's spending hours and hours in the sky pressurized. And a pressurized plane, they have a maximum amount of cycles, pressure cycles they're called. So the idea is that a plane takes off, it has to be pressurized, has to withstand the pressure of the outside air trying to squeeze it like a beer can. And it's got pressurized air inside pushing out, whenever you get on a plane, if you've ever seen the doors, they open from the inside effectively. They pull in and then twist outwards, you know, so that people can get in and out. But it actually pulls inside the plane and then pushes back into the aperture, so that when the air is pushing it, is pushing it into the fuselage, rather than the door being on the outside and being pushed out, and it's only based upon the lock to hold it shut. No, it's better to have a plug that's on the inside, so to speak. Anyway, so a plane like this will be doing lots of small cycles, whereas it will last longer because it's traveling longer distances and having less pressure cycles per day or whatever. Whereas something like a 737, a small commuter plane or something, that's made, something like Southwest Airlines or Ryanair or EasyJet, where they're bouncing, you'll have that plane that will bounce all over the place. Let's look at, for example, let's take an EasyJet. Let's have a look. Trying to think of okay, there we go. So we're going to use Jet Airbus A320, and it's not showing. Let's try that. Okay, let's not try. Let's try. Okay, I'm not doing the right thing there. Give me a sec. Let me find one. Okay. Hang on a sec. I've got to find. My computer's acting a bit weird at the moment, so I'm going to have to go to a backup. Wrong folder. Hang on. Okay, this is an older version. I've got this little chart that I made on Word. So it's different different airlines. These are the registrations on them. So different types. These are the registrations. And when I see them, I just mark them as red. So the black ones I've not seen. The other ones are. Okay, so let's just take this one. EZDP. Okay. DP. That's weird. I would have expected that one to show up. Let's try this one. Okay. Obviously, EasyJet don't do it. Okay, let's try Ryanair. Ryanair, easy enough. Let's try this one. There we go. That's better. Okay, so this is one plane. So 737, and we can see yesterday it went from Dublin to Manchester, from Manchester to Dublin, from Dublin to Faro, from Faro to Dublin to Wrocław, which is Poland, and from Wrocław to Dublin. So that did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flights that day. And then, and it does, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So a plane like this Well, take off and land, take off and land, take off and land 6 times. It did that. That's 6 pressure cycles that did, as opposed to that Airbus A330 earlier, which only has 2. So this will last a third of the lifespan of the other aircraft. So like I say, I mean, these are buses as opposed to coaches, I suppose you could say. So now an example of why you can't keep a flight flying for so long is and I forgot what the flight number was, but it was it oh gosh, trying to remember the name of the airline. Airlines, and they had a was it Hawaiian Airlines? I could have sworn it was. Oh no, it was Oahu. What's the island in? Hang on. I think it was a 200. Can't find it. Sure, it was a 737. There it is. So you may have seen this one. So this was a plane flying just backwards and forwards between Honolulu, in Hawaii. It's flying between islands. And what happened was that the plane went through so many pressure cycles, and it wasn't really quite known at the time as such, but it went through so many pressure cycles that eventually there was a fracture, and literally, and you can see a picture, a chunk of the plane fell off. It's broke up, and it was it was something of a miracle that they managed to get it down, the skill of the pilots, because remember that the fuselage makes up the structural integrity of the airframe. So it was, I mean, look, only one person died, a flight attendant who wasn't strapped down, but it. And where is it? It was at 24,000 feet. The roof ruptured. Controls went loose. Yeah. And there we go. So inadequate inspection of the outer skin, and it was fatigue cracking. So, like I say, the nice thing about things like this is that every single one of these accidents allows lessons to be learned. For example, there was one incident, a British Airways one, again flying a little, a short distance one, and the cockpit window fell out, and the pilot was sucked out, and he's literally hanging out of the plane with his colleagues holding his legs in to stop him falling out while the other one's trying to fly the plane. And what had happened was they'd replaced the windscreen, and they'd used the wrong bolts. The engineer had used the wrong bolts, the wrong size, and so they rattled around. They had movement in them. Gradually, over time, they came loose and got the window came out, and he got sucked out. And like I say, it was only thanks to thanks to his colleagues that he managed to survive. So, like I say, oh, these things can happen, but it's like, yeah, okay. So now they make sure that these procedures are checked and double checked. Other ones where components have failed, and so now they have a system where every single component that goes on an airplane has to be checked. You know, it has to, you can follow a trail all the way from manufacturer to to being on that plane. You know, this is the reason why when you hear about a plane crash and they say debris has been found, they look at the serial numbers written on all the components, which will tell you where that plane came, what it came from. So yeah, it's it's interesting stuff. But there's a plane crash that I want to talk about from a number of years ago. So this was 1989, if I remember correctly. So it was a DC-10, and this relates to what I was talking about earlier. Actually, I'm rambling. I'm going all over the place. So when I was talking about so these planes going straight across like this. Now, there's something I forgot what it's called. It's a category. So when you get a plane, the old planes, they had 4 engines on them, because if one engine failed, you had the other 3 engines. But when you've only got 2 engines, if one fails, you've only got half the power. And now all aircraft are designed so that they can take off and land under one type. Under one engine, or half its engines rather. But back in the old days, they had 4 because they needed at least 2 or 3 to take off and land. But if one failed, they had that redundancy. Now, modern engines are far more reliable. So as a result, more planes go straight across. But there used to be a standard, and there still is, it depends on the aircraft type, where they have to be within a certain distance, a certain amount of hours. So generally, it's like an hour between. So if a plane's going this way, going across here, it needs to be able to land. If there's an emergency, if an engine fails, it needs to be able to land. And so going straight across is the most economical way. But if there's an emergency and it needs to land because an engine's gone down, then they need to be able to maintain their altitude and get to a safe airport to be able to make an emergency landing. So what they would do is they would, many of them would go up this way, up towards Greenland, because that way they're an hour from Iceland and an hour from Greenland, and an hour from Nova Scotia, where they can land at Halifax or something like that. And so they can come down that way. So it keeps them within that area where they can land. But more modern engines are much more reliable. So today, you can, instead of having a 4-engined aircraft that you might need, like a 747, you can do the same thing with with a 767 or a 777, even a 757. And depending on the category of the engine type, depends on whether it can go straight across like these ones here, or whether it's got to go further north, or whether it's going to go much further north. That's not the best example. There's a good example there. So this one's having to go further north because it's probably an older aircraft, and has to sort of come across a place where it can land within an hour. Now, back in the 1970s, although they were designed in the 60s, 2 engines would be enough, but it needed the redundancy. And so what they came up with, they started new wide-body planes. So older planes were thinner and had 4 engines, like the 707. You might have seen in airport, the airport movies, or something like that. So let me open up open up a new window so I can show you. 707 saves aircraft, airliners, Boeing, and can't wake up. Just waiting for my hard drive to wake up. There we go. So this is a 707. The fuselage is skinny. You're probably talking about 2x2 seats or 3x3 seats inside. Very loud engines. These are proper jet engines. You know, suck air in, blow it out the back. Modern engines are turbofan, which have a central core engine that's like this, but it's got a big fan around it, which you know, provides more power, and you know, and also because it's got the air going around it, that means it makes them so much quieter. So so later on, they developed wide-body aircraft, but I'm sorry, and we also have an aircraft like this, the 727, which has 3 engines, and again, it could go transatlantic or, you know, Pacific or something, but still needed that redundancy. So 2 engines could probably do it perfectly fine, but having the 3rd engine allows for that redundancy factor. So when they started making wide bodies, they needed more powerful engines, but they had 3 engines because 2 would probably do it, but again, you need that redundancy. So they came up with 3. That meant that it could do it instead of having to take a longer route. It could do it over a straighter route, and like I say, the engines were more reliable, and gradually over time they become more and more reliable. So this is a MD-11, as Jungle Jargon mentioned. And this is a McDonnell Douglas aircraft, so the Douglas company originally. And there's not a lot of difference between one of these and the DC-10, which is the aircraft that I'm going to mention in a little while. So this is the DC-10. There are 2 ways you can tell the difference. Let's see if I can. There you go. There's a DC-10. Okay. So if you look at the wingtips, this is just the standard original aircraft. And if you notice, it's got a 3rd set of wheels there because the weight of the plane needed them. And then this is the MD-11, which is the later version. So DC-10, Douglas, commercial, number 10. And then MD-11 is McDonnell Douglas because McDonnell and Douglas joined together to you know, conglomerate a company. And the difference is that in the other, you know, the DC-10, it had the old-fashioned lots of dials and things like that, whereas this one has got a glass cockpit, so it's got, you know, electronic VDU displays and more modern systems. So, you know, you may not even need the navigator, you know, or the engineer that's in the back monitoring everything. And the way that you can tell the 2 is this one has got wingtips on it, and also the engine, it's got like a bulge. Let me yeah, if you look at this one, the tube is quite straight, whereas if you look at this one, you can see there's a kind of a bump there. It bulges up a bit. So now back in 2001, 6 weeks after 9/11, this is the plane that I got, the DC-10 I got with Northwest Airlines. Northwest no longer exists, and you know, there's the registration for it there. And I'd never had a go on a DC-10, so I wanted to have a go. So I went from Gatwick. You know, I paid more money, ever so slightly more money, just because I had to travel to London to do it, just so I could have a go on one of these while they still exist. Hardly anybody uses these anymore. They're very rare now. And DC-10s are pretty rare indeed. So, yeah. So So what happened with the DC-10? This is an MD-11, but I'm going to use it for illustrative purposes. So the DC-10 in the 70s, when it was released, had a couple of problems with it. One of them was the cargo doors. They had a locking system, but the metal was able to bend if it was manipulated improperly. And so what happened was a couple of cargo doors fell off in flight because the cargo bay wasn't pressurized. So the cargo bay doors split open, and the air was managed to push its way through and basically enter the cabin. And suddenly there was a decompression problem. And so what happens is with decompression, so this is when you get the plane, and when they talk about if the oxygen masks drop from the top. This happens automatically whenever there's a pressure loss. So what happens is there's a certain amount of oxygen, and that oxygen will last long enough to get below 10,000 feet, at which point the air is thick enough to be able to breathe it. Because up in the sky, the air is too thin to breathe. And not only that, it's like, it is like minus 30 degrees outside, and more. So it is freezing out there, and you can't breathe. So in an emergency, the pilots, they put their masks on, they dive the plane, and they get below that altitude where people can breathe again and manage the situation. That's the emergency procedure. So there was, let me just drag this out of the way and I'll find it. So it was United. I think it's 2. I think was the one. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the Sioux City plane crash, and that was in 1989. Now, it was an interesting one. I say interesting because it's kind of gory to think about this, but here's the thing. If you look here, of the 296 passengers and crew on board, 111 died and 185 survived. And when I explain how, you'll be quite amazed. So, modern aircraft have something called fly-by-wire. So what happens is, in the cockpit, the pilot moves the controls, pulls the joystick, whichever form it is. And what happens is you got wires that go down to motors on the surfaces, which control the flaps, control the ailerons. So the ailerons are what allows it to pivot, to rotate. Let me get myself. Give me a second. Okay, let me just stop sharing for a moment. So I've got a rather dusty DC-10 that eventually I'm going to paint in that Northwest Airlines colours because I've flown on it. So here we have a DC-10. So we've got the flaps here. The flaps increase the size of the wing so that when it's coming into land, it's got a lot more lift. So it's got slats on the front which come down, and then flaps at the back, and it slows the plane down and creates more lift. At the ends, the tips here, you've got the ailerons. So what happens is the ailerons will go like this, and so what it does is, this thing is so dusty. So what it will do is it will give the rotation there. You've got the rudder, which is the yaw. That's the side to side, and then you've got the tailplane here, and that rotates so it goes up and down. So that's your basic control surfaces. Now, this is so dusty. Gosh, the state of it. Look at the state of the muck on that. Watch. How messy is that? Anyway, so what happened with this DC-10? that it's flying along, and suddenly there's a big massive shake, and people on the plane described it like going through a really bad pothole. It's just this big lumpy judder, and you don't get that kind of thing. The pilots were like, "What on earth was that?" And what they saw on their instruments, that the top engine had failed, and then the engineer told them that they lost all the hydraulic pressure. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a modern airliner has wires and servo motors, effectively, that control these surfaces. But in the really old days, like World War II, and the early airlines like the DC-3 and things like that, old piston planes, they literally had cables. So when you'd pull the controls, it would pull a cable, and when you turned it, it would pull another cable, and those would go down the plane, and they would pull pull the surfaces. Well, when you've got a big plane, you can't really do it like that, because you're literally talking about how you're pulling. So to make a big airplane like this, and the bigger it is, the more drag it's got, the more control surfaces it's got, so the more pressure you're going to need to be able to turn the rudder left and right, to be able to control the ailerons and the tailplane. So when you pull that stick back, you're pulling a lever which goes down the plane and makes the tailplane move. That requires an awful lot of pressure. So what they did was, later versions, which is like the DC-10 has, they would have a cable system, but then goes to a hydraulic system, which then squeezes liquid through. So it would use servos like power steering kind of thing, and then that would squirt the liquid and suck it out or whatever to make the pieces move. So a lot of the I think, if there's a picture. I thought there might be a picture. A lot of the hydraulics clusters here, because it's got the rudder and the tailplane to control. And what happened was, so a jet engine, let me find you a picture of a turbofan engine. Okay. So this is a turbofan engine. So as I mentioned before, let's open up this. Okay. So what you've got is the fan disc, which is a big, massive blade, series of blades. They're all made out of titanium usually. And you've got I don't know how. Maybe I should explain how jet engine works, because they're actually really, really simple. So what you've got is you've got the air coming in. You've got a big disc here that provides power through there, but the real power comes through the center of the engine. So what happens is, you can see the green part here is all combined together. So you've got the fan disc and you've got the low pressure compressor here. So what's happened is, the air, as it goes through each sets of blades, is being squeezed and squeezed smaller and smaller, and then it gets squeezed again, and then in this section here, it gets squirted with fuel and ignited, and that then pushes the air backwards out, spinning the high pressure one, which is what spins this, and then pushes the green ones here, because the air is now expanding. You can see the air's been squeezed, it's been ignited, and then it's expanding again as pressure, and then is blown out the back. And they use the pressure of that being blown out the back to go down the drive shaft to spin the front. So effectively, all you need to do is start the engine, and then it feeds itself. Other than squirting fuel into it, it feeds itself. And so, but the problem you get with an engine, any jet engine, any engine, I suppose, is that even a propeller plane, is that the blades are spinning incredibly fast, like 10,000 plus. I don't know what the number is offhand, but it's spinning so fast, revs per minute, that the pressure for those blades to stay in. Imagine if you've been on a roundabout, like a kid, on a, I don't know if you call them that in America. If you've been on a roundabout and you set towards the outside, you can feel yourself being pulled out. If you go around a corner quick, your head wants to move, to the left or right, again, the opposite direction to where you're steering. Well, the same applies here. But when you've got a plane that's doing 1,000, 10,000, whatever the number is, revs per minute, then the pressure to not have that fly away is immense. And unfortunately, what happened with let's use that. What happened with Flight 232 was that there was a fracture in the engine component in the fan disc, and this happened when it was manufactured. It was something like it didn't get enough nitrogen or had too much nitrogen. I can't remember what it was now. And as a result, there was a fatigue crack, and because over time it got worse and worse, and eventually the disc failed, and it just shattered. And it shattered in the in this section here, and it fell off, literally fell off out of the back of the plane, and what happened was it penetrated the hydraulic lines that were here, and so the hydraulic fluid was all leaking out, and the pilots suddenly didn't have any controls, because if there's no hydraulic fluid to be squirted down the plane to control the ailerons and the tailplane and the rudder, and the flaps, any of those things, you've got no controls at all. So you've got a plane that's flying at high altitude, and somehow 185 people managed to survive. How's that possible with no controls? I mean, this, it's baffling, really. Well, what happened was they had to come up with a solution. It's not like you can say, oh, well, you'll just have to give up then. Well, lives are at stake, including theirs. One of the theoretically, you could fly a plane from one place to another without a pilot these days. But the pilots, I like the idea of having the pilot, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that, their lives are at stake. If it's someone who's flying a drone sat on the ground somewhere, then, their life isn't at stake. So if something goes wrong, it's like, well, funny, when your life is at stake, finding solutions becomes a bit more of a priority, I suppose you could say. So they had to find a solution to this. And so what they figured out was that by changing the thrust on the engines, they could steer. So by increasing the thrust on this one, it would push that way. And by increasing the thrust that way, it would push that way. Now, unfortunately, the problems that they had meant that the plane wanted to lean to the right. Its natural inclination was to tilt to the right. So what they had to do, and these guys had, didn't really have any control, but they're holding the stick turned all the way, and they're white knuckle just trying to hold what might remain of control, but really they had none. And so what they were doing is they were alternating the thrust. So they had this one at pretty much full all the time, and this one lower powered, which was keeping it but it still wanted to lean. So effectively, if they wanted to turn anywhere, they had to use its natural inclination to turn to be able to find, to change direction. And so that's what they did, and they were heading to Sioux City. There was an engineer, a flight training engineer who worked on the DC-10, who was in the back, and he moved forward and he helped do the controls, the power controls. And so there was another problem. So they managed to steer the plane, rudimentary, but it was better than nothing and falling out of the sky and getting killed. So there they were, trying to control the plane as best they could. And generally, the structure of the plane was fine. So that was a good news for them. They didn't have such problems at the back that, the fuselage was rupturing and moving around, so at least they had that. They didn't have to worry about the tail falling off, for example. So as the plane is coming in to land, they were faced with another problem, because an airliner lands at approximately 120 knots, so about 135, 140 miles per hour. So it lands and it comes in, it's a fairly, it's a shallow angle. There you go. So it comes in at a fairly shallow angle, and well, it slows down to a certain speed with the flaps down, of course. So it's going slow, it's controlled. They didn't have any of that. This plane was coming in fast. It was coming in at 200 plus miles per hour instead of 120. So imagine, trying to drive a car, and you're coming up to a curve and the speed limit is 60 and you're doing 90 and you can't do anything else. If you don't do 90, then the wheels will fall off or whatever, so you've got to find a way to, to solve this. Well, it was like, okay, we're just going to have to come down really fast. And they almost managed it. They were so close to managing it. It's amazing that they managed to do this. So there they were, coming in, and unfortunately, just as they were slowing, just as they were coming in, the wing dipped. So they're all lined up with the runway, and the wing dipped. And and of course there'd already been navigational problems, because of course they want to land on the longest runway. Let me see if I can find it for you, because I think it might be interesting for you to see that. Let's load up Google Earth. Okay, Google Earth started. A screen share. Okay, so okay, so here's the airport. So they wanted to land on this run. This is the best runway to land on. It's the longest one. And you've got this one here, which is shorter. But if I remember correctly, they ended up trying to land on this one. This was the short runway, but it was in a straight line. The plane was losing altitude. Oh, sorry. And actually, I've forgot to mention another thing, another problem they were faced before this. So when the plane would turn, it would dip. It would go down. So they would have to keep pushing the power higher in order to get any lift. So they've got the constant problem of turning, and it's rocking up and down because they're having to manually change the thrust levers in order to stay up. But all the time they're still coming down. And so like I say, as they're coming in, they're having to use the short runway, and just as they're about to hit the runway, just as they're about to land, might probably, a quarter of a mile, which is a short amount of time in an airplane. You're talking a matter of seconds, like 5-10 seconds kind of time, at 200 miles an hour. As the plane was coming in, it started to dip, and the plane hit the ground at this angle. It hit the ground, it's hard to show you, but if you imagine there's the flat, it hit like that. And then it tumbled, it broke apart and tumbled. And there's video footage of it. Let me see if I can find it. Hang on. Okay, this is a news report, which I think has the footage.
Night. And before we leave you for this program, we want to update our top story tonight. The fire chief in Sioux City, Iowa, now estimates 195 people died when a United Airlines DC-10 attempted an emergency landing there. That would mean as many as 125 people survived. It would also mean, if memory serves me, this is the second worst domestic single-plane air crash in history. The plane hit about a half mile from the runway. It bounced twice, landed upside down, and burst into flames, as you just saw. This flight was bound to Philadelphia from...
So, yeah, it was awful. I mean, the report is not correct. The end result was, 111 people died, 185 survived. Now, there's another factor, and this is a terrible tragedy part. So, on that day, there was a special thing that the airline was doing, that kids traveled for free if they traveled with a paying adult. And there were an awful lot of children on that flight. Lots. A large percentage were children. Normally, you get, mostly adults with a few kids. In this case, it was, a large percentage of kids. And they were taking advantage of this, deal. Well, there were some kids that were lap babies, basically, small children, toddlers, small, like, couldn't even talk kind of an age, very small children. And they didn't have proper seats. They were lap children. You just held on to them when the plane was taking off and landing, that kind of thing, And they didn't really have a proper seat, didn't have a proper seat. You're going to do squeeze them, crush them as so the procedure was to put them on the ground and hold them there. And one of the stewardesses, she had to tell people what to do. And so she had to say to a couple of people, put your baby on the ground and hold them down while you're in the brace position. And what happened was, when the plane crashed, the children were sent flying. They weren't restrained. They were just sent flying, and they got killed. And that lady, she still feels that today. She has to live with that guilt of, it was, it was the airline's procedure, the policy for it. But that doesn't really make it any better for her or obviously the kids. So yeah, that was a real tragedy. But like I say, the pilot survived, and 185 people survived. There could have been 296 deaths that day, but there were only 111. And I know that sounds, blasé, but it was it was a skill. It was amazing skill that they managed to control the situation and not to be as bad as it was. And they were so close to making it. If that plane hadn't dipped, it would have hit the ground. It would have been going too fast, but it would have, hit the ground and slid, and then would have, just gone off the end of the runway or something like that and just dug itself into the dirt. It wouldn't have tumbled and caught fire and all that kind of stuff. Maybe it would have caught fire, but they would have been evacuated people, and people would have got off, and maybe you might have had one or two people that got seriously injured or killed, but not 111. So I think that's amazing feat. Now, when it came to the investigation, they had to figure out what had happened, and of course they didn't know. It was like, okay, we got a load of debris. How do you sift through the debris and figure out what happened? Well, you can go off what the pilots were saying. You can take flight data recorders, the voice recorders and things like that. And of course, they were saying that they'd lost pressure. They'd lost the hydraulic pressure. So it's like, okay, well, something's gone. Number 2 engine, which is the center one, that had failed. So, and when they looked through the wreckage, they couldn't find the fan disc. So the fan disc is out there somewhere. And they gave something like, I think it was like $10,000 or $100,000 reward for anybody who could find it. And it was months later that they eventually found this disc, when some farmers, lady in a combine harvester, was doing the work, and she felt some pressure as she was working, so she pulled back, and that was when they found the fan disc, and it was literally embedded in the ground. It had fallen from 20,000 feet or whatever it was. Probably say what the altitude was around somewhere, but yeah, so they found that, and that allowed them to put the puzzle together and discover what happened. Now, there was another element that was bad news, and that was let me just take a drink, get a bit. So things like fan discs and engine parts, they're removed and checked and refurbished and put back into other planes. Well, the fan disc itself was examined. They use ultrasonic testing and to see if there are any fatigue cracks. And unfortunately, it had been tested several months before and been given the all clear. And there was a fatigue crack that was growing at that time. It should have been detected, but it wasn't. And so afterwards, processes were put in place to make sure that these kind of glitches, these kind of instances are avoided due to better checking. So again, every plane crash gets investigated, and they try to figure out what went wrong and how can it not go wrong in the future. So Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Whether it's just about planes or this incident, this one. Just watching the live chat on my other screen. I think I'll share this. This is on the Wikipedia page. This is the NTSB report. It's the this is the flight path. So you can see it only turned to the right. It wouldn't turn any other way. And you can see this is the way it was going. This is where it happened by the look of it. Oh no, sorry, engine failure with that. And then it was just all over the place, you can see. And, you know, they ended up doing circles to try and get around. Don't know how it managed to turn that way. And then there was that one. And then finally, you know, but yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry, Jungle. It's not so much the question on that. One of the principal lessons that was learned on this to avoid this kind of plane having this kind of incident again, they created valves in the hydraulic system that could be closed. So because, like I say, when the fan disc broke, it went through the hydraulic lines that control the rudder and the tailplane. But what they did was they put these hydraulic valves in so that if a pressure loss started, they could shut it down and stop any more leakage. So effectively, the fluid that's in this part of the plane will still be there and still be usable. So at least they would have had the flaps and the ailerons to allow it to at least have a bit more control. And of course, they could use the thrust, you know, for up and down, and then the thrust, because you just do asymmetric thrust, which will make it turn that way, which will solve the rudder problem. So the tailplane problem will be solved by increasing thrust will increase lift, decreasing thrust will decrease it. So that's how you control that part. The asymmetric power on the engines will make it go that way or that way, which is the yaw, which is done by the rudder. And then, of course, you've got the backups here. Shah, a lot of the people over the wings were the ones that tended to survive. People in the back, less likely. But the pilots survived. The fuselage broke up, and the pilots had to be cut out. I think it was upside down and kind of looking in the dirt, basically. But they had to cut them out of the wreckage. And like I say, all of them survived. The guy I'm most surprised with was the engineer guy that who was flying in the plane as a passenger, and he was sat right behind the controls. You got the two pilots and the engineer there, and then this training engineer who like he's the guy like an instructor for simulators. He was sat at the back, and of course, when you hit the ground, your body goes forwards. He could have just smashed himself into the console. So yeah. I mean, when I fly, I like to sit at the back. I do. It's my favorite spot. I like a window seat as far back as possible. Two advantages of it. The first one is that less people want to sit there. Most people want to be towards the front, because that means when the plane gets there, they can get off quicker and get through immigration or whatever. So they can get off the plane quicker and get to where they're going quicker. So less chance, you got a better chance of getting your window seat, which I like the window seat. And the other advantage is I can see down. If you're sat over the wing, then you're looking through the wing and you don't really get to see very much. Whereas when you sat at the back, you get a great view. So that's nice. And not only that, not many plane crashes reverse into things. So the back part is safer, but it depends on the type of crash. You know, if a plane stalls, then that's the bit that's going to hit the ground first frequently. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a fun story. I say fun in a kind of slightly cynical sense. So a number of years ago, let me find share my pictures again. So I need to sort these pictures out, I think. Picks up. Yeah, I normally store everything properly. So a number of years ago, I went off to America on, it wasn't that plane. Wait a minute. Let me just drag it that way for a second. I'm just going to make sure. Yeah, it's not that one. What I thought. There you go. I was on that plane. Yeah. Okay. So so what happened was a number of years ago, I was going to America. I was going to Newark Airport, in New Jersey, which is just across from Manhattan, and I actually prefer that as an airport. You know, it's simple to navigate around. You know, not really jungle. Anyway, so what happened was, so I'm on a plane and I'm going to New York, and I'm coming into land. So you know, and there was a lot of turbulence that day. You know, it was very choppy, and you know, it was when I was putting on a little bit of weight. So when you're bumping around and you know you lose like 30 feet suddenly, and you just stall a little bit, you know, your stomach does the roller coaster ride thing. So and it's wobbling and bouncing around. You just everything's shaking, you know, and it's you know some of it was you know I was starting to worry whether my fillings would still be you know in my mouth by the time we got on the ground. Anyway, so so we had 40 minutes of you know fairly heavy turbulence. So we're all waiting to land because you know flying into an airport you get traffic jams effectively. And what they do is they have these holding patterns around an airport, and they just sit there going round and around and around, and then they gradually bleed them off, and they come in one at a time. So here I am sat on a plane, and I'm just waiting for us to waiting for us to land, and we're coming in, and we're almost hitting the ground. I mean, you know, almost like this picture here, a little bit higher, you know, about the height of the plane. So the wheels are approximately there. So we're coming into land, and I can see the shadow of the plane on the ground. And I'm thinking, you know, and in my head for like the last 20, you know, 10, 20 minutes, I'm thinking, it'll be all right. We'll be down on the ground soon, because I'm feeling green. So I'm thinking, it'll be all right. We'll be on the ground soon. You try not to do the equivalent of car sick, okay? So here we are, coming into land, and then suddenly the engines roar, we do a missed approach. Now, let me explain what that means. So let me zoom out. Let's go to Newark Airport. So here's Newark. You can see I know it well. So generally the way it works for Newark is they land on one runway and they take off on the other. So I don't know if we'll see any planes. There you go. This is one that's landing. So it'll be landing on that one, and these are the ones getting ready to take off on this one. There may even be one, you know, here or just leaving. So yeah, so you got Terminal A, Terminal B, Terminal C, C being Continental because it used to be Continental Airlines, now United Airlines. So we're coming into land. In this at this time, we were coming in this way. So here we are, we're coming into land. I can see the shadow of the plane on the ground. I'm thinking, that's all right, we'll be down soon. And we do a missed approach. Now, what that means is, so on planes, they've got something called ILS, Instrument Landing System. And it's an automated landing system. So what happens is, at the end here, you've got a radio transmitter, and it transmits a cone up the runway. So if you imagine you've got this cone like that, so when the plane's coming in, it will basically say, you know, the system will say, oh, you're a little bit too far that way, so it'll adjust it this way. Or you're a bit too high, so it'll reduce it down. So the idea is that it'll fly down the cone. And that's the automated system. Now, sometimes they use automated landings. Other times they do manual landings. They've got to do it because, you know, in an emergency, if the automatic landing system failed, then you know, they need to be able to have the experience to do it themselves. So usually, you know, or frequently they'll do automated ones, and frequently they'll do manual ones just to keep them fresh. So so what happens is the engines roar, and we do a missed approach, and we end up spending another 30 minutes rotating around. Well, probably about a minute after the engines roar, I'm afraid it was 2 bags full, sir. Yeah. Technicolor rainbow, I'm afraid. So eventually we come and we land, and all that's great, and I go back home, and all is wonderful. Except for 6 months later, the plane I was on was at the bottom of the Atlantic, because that was the same aircraft from Air France 447, and that one is one of the most modern plane crashes in Europe, or you know, a European or American designed aircraft. What happened was that you've got these tubes. Let me show you what I mean. So find a photo that shows them well. That was the plane I flew on recently. Let's see if there's okay. Well, you've got these tube things that stick out of the side. I'll tell you what, let me show you military aircraft, because they're exactly the same technology. I'll look at actually, tell you what, let's show you something British. And I'm going to be a bit bold now, but this is what my dad makes. My dad makes these things. So, do they have pizza tubes on them? Where are they? Okay, these are slots in them instead. Let's find something else. Let's go for a Tomcat. I know Tomcats have got them. Navy fighters, Tomcat. Let's go for my favorite squadron, F-32. Okay. So these things here, and they're nozzles, effectively. And what happens is the air goes through and it tells them what speed they're going, but it also gives them pressure, so it tells them what altitude they're at, things like that. So it feeds the pilot information, speed and altitude, which is basically, it's a pressure sensor. So so what happened was, on this airliner, the pitot tube got iced up. So it had water in it, and let's go back to that Airbus A330. There. So what happened was the pitot tube got blocked up, and these aircraft fly by wire, so they've got a computer that controls them. So so what happens? It was that the plane can automatically override the pilot to stop it from pulling up too hard, or so if the pilot goes fast and then pulls back, if you go high too quick, it will stall. It will run out of air going over the wings, and it won't have enough lift, and then it will stall because it hasn't got enough speed to go at that kind of rate of climb. So it's an automated system that prevents the pilot from overdoing what the plane can do, and that saves lives. Well, equally, when a plane is flying at high altitude with the autopilot, the plane's just flying itself, so to speak. They just turn the switch to put in the course and direction. And nowadays they use GPS for navigation, so it's pretty hard to get lost. And so what happened was the I better keep an eye on the time there. So the plane was flying at high altitude. It was on the I forgot what the phrase is. It was flying itself, basically. It was on automatic pilot. Thank you. That was what I was thinking of. And then suddenly the automatic pilot turned off. It pinged to tell them. And then they weren't getting reliable information. The computer on board wasn't able to give them the speed and things like that. And it basically, what happened was the pitot tube iced up, wasn't and because it wasn't getting the information, the computer basically went, well, I don't know what to do now. And so the pilots had to take control. And unfortunately, the pilots went beyond what they should have done. And so what they ended up doing was, yeah, I know what you mean, Shah. So what happened was that they didn't have the reliable information, and the computer was like just giving them funny mixed messages. And so they thought that they were going down. And so what they did was they pivoted the plane up, and they continued to do it. And they got confused. It was really confusion that did it. And so what happened was they ended up going up, pivoting higher and higher and higher and higher, thinking that they were going down. And they didn't have the speed sensors to tell them their speed, but they did have their artificial horizon, which should have told them. And so what ended up happening was eventually it stalled. It didn't have enough lift, and so it just stalled and fell out of the sky and, broke apart. And that was off the coast of Brazil. So, yeah, that was fun. But like I say, these things are incredibly rare. I mean, I know I've talked about two, but if you actually look at, the chances, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than die in a plane crash. You know, I believe those numbers are correct. You know, it's something that you don't really need to worry about too much. There's another thing as well that's worth mentioning, and that is when you're on a plane, and you know when they do the safety briefing and things like that, and they tell you, you know, you're not allowed to use any electronic stuff. If they say you're not allowed to use an electronic stuff because that can interfere with the plane, they're lying. They are lying. Okay, they wouldn't allow a plane to operate if someone using you know, an MP3 player or a laptop would stop the plane from working. You know, that would just be crazy. What they actually need is you to be paying attention, because the worst time, the most, you know, the most likely time for there to be an emergency is on takeoff or landing. And so they need you to be paying attention. So if your head is listening to you know, to your headphones, listening to music, you don't get to hear the pilot saying, you know, we have an emergency, brace, 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 or something like that. At which point the cabin crew will then start yelling, saying, you know, head down, get down, head down, get down. And you know, they're telling you to brace and, you know, that kind of thing. Because the plane is going to crash into the ground, or it's going to crash land, or whatever, you know. It's like, we need you to be paying attention, not listening to your own thing and being in your own little world. You know, this is important. So, like I say, when they tell you this, it's not because they're trying to be jerks and, you know, because it's going to interfere with the plane or any of that kind of stuff. It's just because that's when there's most likely to be an emergency and they need you to be paying attention. And of course, you know, when you get on a plane, make sure you know where the exits are, because there's, you know, if something happens and they need to evacuate, let's say there's a fuel leak, you know, there's a fuel leak in one of the wings and you've got hot engines next to it and they need to evacuate, then there is a natural inclination to just go for the nearest door. And if that means climbing over 4 people and climbing over the 2 chairs in front of you, you'll do it, because the survival instinct is, you know, is strong. So make sure you know where your nearest exit is, because there's no, you know, if you're in a row of seats and there's one exit there and the other exit's down over here, you want to go for the nearest one, not the furthest one, and it might be behind you. So I know there's another GASP thing that's coming along. So I think I'm going to finish now. Hope. Yes, Tandrunk, that's right. There's a guy called Vass Aviation, and he does a lot of videos, and they're really well made, because you'll have, you know, it'll sort of show where the plane is on the runway or where it is flying around, and, you know, it gives out the radio things, you know, sort of the communication coming from the controllers and the pilots. So those are worth watching. What, Shah? What do you mean, no? Oh, okay. It's been rescheduled. Okay, well, that's fair enough. Okay, well, let me put it out there. Has anybody got any questions, something that they might find interesting? While I wait for a question, I'm going to show you something a bit interesting. So I'm going to show you some interesting planes that you can see around here and there. So everybody is familiar with the Boeing 747. So we all know what a Boeing 747 looks like. It's basically, you know, a big wide-body airplane with, you know, a bulge on the top, which has got an extra deck in there, 4 engines, you know. So we all know what these look like. However, and you can see how long it is. That's such a great photo. Hang on. Oh, it is. So yeah, they're big planes. Some of them are cargo ones where they've gone and taken the seats out, or they've been built without seats and windows. But check this out. That's a Boeing 747 SP, special purpose, or sorry, special performance rather. And it's short. Look how short it is. Normally, it's like over here and over here. They're really long planes, but this one is a really, really short version. And it was used for getting people, moving a fair amount of people fairly quickly, and often hot and high conditions as well. So when an airport is high up, how often are there survivors, percentage of crashes? I don't know. I mean, most of the time, aliens taken by the fighter jets. I don't know about things like that. I'm not sure such things exist. But yeah, look how short that is. You compare that to the normal size. It's miniature. So that's one plane. Oh yeah, and then there was this one as well, which was the and I saw that plane. So this was the NASA 747 that carried the space shuttle. They had a couple of them, and they would use it to take it from from the place where it landed, Edwards or something, and then take it back to Cape Canaveral for for repair. Also, repair all the bits that came off it. Because they got ceramic tiles on them. Anyway, so you got that one, and then there's another plane. So you got something called this is an Airbus A300, which fine plane. Anyway, but they also made a special version of it, and it's not on this section. It's in cargo, and it's this thing, and you can see it's called the Beluga. It is it's a modified Airbus A300 with a big massive body thing on the top of it. It's not for passengers, it's for moving airplane parts around. And there are 5 of them. I saw one today, in fact. And it's got a big hatch at the front, and it's swallow. They use it for there you go. That's what it's like inside, and they use it to move aircraft parts, because Airbus is a conglomerate of of multiple. They have components made all over the place. So they have fuselage made at one place, and the wings made somewhere else, and the front cockpit fuselage area made somewhere else, and then they'll take them all to Toulouse or Hamburg or wherever it is, and then they will assemble them into a finished airplane there. Airbus has multi nations, so they all want to protect their aviation industry. But there you go. There's a fuselage being eaten, so to speak. Nom nom nom. And then I got a picture around here somewhere of there you go, of 2 fuselages. So what was that bit of video that there was? That one? No, something else. So yeah, the fun plane there, and we also have one of these big Russian cargo planes, the Antonov 124. But they made a special one, a bigger version, and it's actually the biggest plane around. And this is my photo of it at Manchester Airport several years ago. In what year was it? 2013. And it was quite funny actually, because I was watching the local news, and they said, you know, they were doing an article about how there was a new air traffic control, a new control tower that was going to go into service, you know, in the next, you know, the next few days. And then the person doing the, you know, doing the article, you know, live from the control tower, she said, "Oh, and we've also got the biggest plane in the world today." And I thought she was going to talk about the Airbus A380, you know, the big super jumbo plane. And, you know, well, they come in like 3-4 times a day. Whereas, and then they looked out of the window and they had that there. And 5 minutes later, I was out the door and going to Manchester Airport to go and take some photos, because I've only ever seen it twice close up and once in the sky flying over where I live, actually. And I mean, you can look at the size of it compared to a van, you know. So you can see, I mean, you could drive that van through the engine. That's how big it is, because this one is small, that one's further away. And it was built to carry the Russian space shuttle. There's only ever been one of them. There it is. So that's Buran, which is the Russian space shuttle. They made a couple of them. Only one ever flew. It flew up, it came down, all automated, and never flew again. The Cold War finished, and they didn't have any money for the space program. But you know, the planes still exist. They're actually talking about making some more. The Chinese are going to do them. But yeah, it's there you go. I mean, look how big that is. That's an APC, a four-wheeled APC. And you could probably get another one next to it, or at least another vehicle quite large there. You know, you can get helicopters in these things. So, yeah. And I mentioned the other one that I saw. So I just happened to be watching Flight Radar 24, and you know, I'm over here in Manchester, and I'm looking out the window, and I could see you know, a big plane going by, and I thought, well, it's a 747 or something, you know, it had multiple engines, you know, more than two. So it's like, okay, well, let's have a look. So I'm looking around, and you know, the angle that it was going, it looked like, you know, it was going this way, but it's like, okay, so let me just explain. So a little plane like this is a little, you know, a little train, you know, the kind of thing you go to like flight school in, a Cessna 152, something of that nature. Then you've got something like this, which is a Dash 8. So it's a high wing propeller, you know, jet propeller plane. You know, with you know, it's the kind of thing you get. They do short flights. They don't go too high, so they're good for, you know, short jumps. So you might go from Philadelphia to New York or something. You know, not very far, a few hundred miles. And then you've got, you know, things like these, which are your Airbus A320s, and then you got something like this, which is a 737, sorry, 75, sorry, a 777, or maybe a 767, or an A330, something of that nature. So two-engined plane. So I'm looking down, and you know, now this kind of thing is something like a Beech. So it's like a twin-engine, you know, something that normally uses this picture will be a twin-engine Beech. So it's not a very big plane, you know. So I'm looking out there, and it's like, well, it's not that, and it's not that, and it's not that, because these are twin-engine Beech. They're small planes, you know. Let me show you an example of what I mean by a little twin-engine Beech. So, trying to think. Oh, I know. Let's try. I've got a plane that I've flown in many years ago when I was a kid. Where is it? It's really somewhere. I should get these a bit more organized. There we go. There you go, something like that. So the little, oh, wrong one. Sorry, that was the right one. So this kind of one would be something like that. The kind of one, the one that's up there would be something like something like this. So a small propeller powered, it's got a jet engine in it, but it's a jet propeller, turboprop. So it'd be something like that. Small, so that's one of those. Something like this is something like a 737. So there you go. Fun little one, Powerpuff Girls. I got the transfers for that. I need to make that, finish off that sometime. I got lots of pictures of it. I want to get it right, but yeah. So a small 737 like this, and then this is an A330 or 777. Let's go with the 777. So something like that. And you can actually tell which type of plane is which. For example, a 777 and a 330 look very similar to each other. Let me show you the comparison. Airliners, Airbus, A330. Let's see if we can find a picture that's. I'll use that one again. Let's find a comparison photo. Okay, so this one, you can see how the tailplane there is kind of like a flat vertical slab. See if we can find a photo that shows it well. It's like a knife almost, or a chisel tail. And just so you know, inside this there's an auxiliary power unit. It's a small jet engine, and it provides power for the plane. So it's just, because when the plane's on the ground, it doesn't need the engines on. Uses up a lot of fuel, whereas having a little jet engine at the back that just sucks in a bit of air and pops out. It's something, it's almost like a small helicopter might have. It just provides enough power to keep the lights on and the systems going and everything that you might need for, it's like having it's like your car. You turn the key the first slot to first bit, and it just keeps the lights on. You can use the radio, but you haven't actually started the engine. But so you can tell that one. A 767. Let's find a side shot. That'll do. Okay, so a 767, you can see that it goes down, and this one goes up. So it dips at the end. Whereas an A330, which is a similar plane, This is flat across the top, and has a much higher angle there. So you can tell little things like that. When you know what you're looking for, you can tell the difference. But and one of the reasons why I've got so many of this is because I spent a lot of time dealing with 9/11 truthers, and a lot of people were sort of like, "Oh, they're fake planes," and it's like, yeah, no, they weren't. That the 767 is a fairly obvious shape. There aren't any other aircraft that look the same. You can tell from the video footage, that kind of thing. Then there were people saying, "Oh, they don't have this white line." Actually, yes, they do. So many of them did. There was the remote, the remote control planes, and it was the government and remote control planes. It's like, okay, there weren't any. There were only 5 military 767s on 9/11. One of them was this, and there's this big massive bulge on the top that kind of gives it away. And also, there were that thing existed until 2007 when it was cut up. This was actually the prototype 767 built. So yeah, that plane existed until 2007, if I remember correctly. And then the other one is like, oh, the planes were like stripped down. The planes were remote controlled and there was nobody in them. And it's like, yeah, that's not actually possible. Now with the A330, it's more possible because this is a fly-by-wire plane. So as I mentioned before, you pull a joystick in the cockpit and that sends a signal down, the computer sends a signal down and it tells, the ailerons or the tailplane or whatever to move according to what the controls are being told to do. This plane, sorry, if you were to take this plane and you wanted to remote control it, well, I suppose you could, control the computer that controls the parts. But you'd have to do some kind of work to do it. Whereas with the 767, that would be the worst kind of plane to try and do it with, because to try and turn one of these into a remote controlled drone, you'd have to strip it down. Yes, I did, Shah. In fact, I'll show you pictures in a minute. Anyway, to strip, you'd have to strip it down, because when, as I was mentioning earlier, this is an old-fashioned plane. It had a pulley and wheels, and then went to hydraulic systems. But the only thing it had was a servo control for it, and the servo control system is kind of like, yes, I did see that one, sure. Okay, I'll go with that in a minute, Drunk. So when you control, when you pull, pull the yoke to make the plane go up, it pulls cables, which then goes to our hydraulic system via a servo system. And the servo system is like power steering in a car. It, takes some of the strain off the pilot. So, you don't have to pull hard across all the forces to squeeze everything through, squeeze the hydraulic fluid around. You've actually got a lot more control. It's much easier. Like I say, it's like power steering, but you still need someone in the cockpit or controlling the steering wheel to make it go. It doesn't do it itself. Now, Town Drunk asked about planes can't fly that low. Well, obviously they can fly that low. Here's a picture of one flying that low. However, that's not quite the claim that's being made. What they were saying is that planes can't fly at 500 miles an hour at low altitude. Now, that's not true. They can. They're just not supposed to. Now, when you look, there's a manual that goes with a plane like this, and that manual tells you the speeds to land at, the speeds to take off at, the speeds that you should fly at under a certain altitude. So at high altitude, they can fly fast because the air is thin, there's less drag, and the higher a plane can fly, the better, so to speak. They generally fly about sort of 30 to 42,000 feet on average. Some planes can get that high, other planes can't quite get that high, but it depends on the type, and depends on the engines as well. So what happens is, at low altitude, the air is thicker, which means there's a lot more drag, which means that there's a lot more stress. Now, a plane can do it. It's not supposed to, because it reduces the lifespan of the airframe. So you remember I was saying before about pressure cycles? Well, the same applies to all other things: engines, the fuselage, all those sorts of things. So if the wings and the tailplane and the rudder, and so on. The stabilizer, that's the big one that sticks out the top. If you now imagine it like a car, if you drive a car, as if every green light is the start of a race and every red light is an emergency stop, then it's not going to be long before your engine is screwed up and your tires are just messed, just screwed up completely. So, in order to get 10,000 miles out of a set of tires, for just to use a number at random, this is the normal acceleration, the normal driving that you would do. Same works for planes. So they want a plane. These planes cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The engines alone will cost, tens of millions. So they're hideously expensive components. As a result, you want it to last not 5 years, not 10 years, probably more than 20, probably more like 30, maybe even more. So you want to stretch it out, because if you want, like I say, you drive a pretty good car too hard and you're going to wear it out. Same works. So they write the manuals based upon the 20, 30, 40-year lifespan expected of the plane. Now, when they say about when these truthers try saying that the plane can't fly at that altitude, no, it can. And things like the wings, Boeing have a standard that it's supposed to withstand 150% of the maximum workload it would ever be expected to do. So, for example, and they bend the wings. They actually have. Let me see if I can find it for you. There we go. So I'll show you this video. So this
plane would be destroyed. The engineers needed to know if the 777 wings could survive the strongest forces that turbulence or bad handling could produce. They were also interested in whether the same wing design could be used on future, heavier versions of the plane.
So what they do is they bend the wing. They literally have the, things, they pull it up and they'll bend it and bend it. Let me zoom forward a bit. So,
Condition 15 in 75 seconds, starting the ramp now. Nav attention, we're now loading to 130% of design limit load. The ramp rate is again 75 seconds.
So bear in mind that this, this load is the worst turbulence you can think of You know, that luggage is falling out of the overhead bins. Your teeth are rattling around. You know, the fillings in your teeth are falling out. You know, and you know, if you weren't strapped into the chair, you'd be stuck to the ceiling or smashing onto the ground. You know, so that's the maximum expected workload.
Although he was no longer the leader of the team, Alan Mullally was also there to watch.
Look at the state of that wing. So they succeeded. That's them. Okay. You see that? The back, you know, the smash when that happened. I'm going to show that again. So that wing survived 154% of the maximum expected workload. And, you know, so like I say, when they say they can't do that, no, that's nonsense. The other one is engines can't go that fast at that altitude. Yes, they can. They're just not supposed to, because again, it overstresses them. You know, I got that information from a guy who makes engines. You know, at Rolls-Royce at Derby. So again, someone who knows what they're talking about. A lot of the time, when you hear about these 9/11 truthers, they have no idea what they're talking about. They just don't know anything about planes. And one of I'm sorry, I was going to show Shah. Shah said you've never seen. You know, have you seen them? Where is it? That was not enough. It's in window. If I remember correctly, window. So this is 2001. Sorry, this. Yeah, I think this was 2001. This was the May I went to America. It was the second time I'd been. And there it is in the distance. This is flying out of Newark. So there's IKEA across the way. If I show you, I think, is that the IKEA? Let's stick it down there. There's an IKEA around here somewhere further down the road. But where is it? Is it still there? I don't see it. I don't want to waste people's time. But yeah, there's an IKEA about there. And, you know, there's taking off. There's a big train yard. This is where the PATH train runs down. There's the Statue of Liberty. This is a very old digital camera. State of the art. And there's the World Trade Center. Like I say, that was May 2001. And one of the things that amazed me was this. That's one of my favorite sort of things, where you basically got the park with just skyscrapers lining around the edge of it, which I just thought was fascinating. You know, it's kind of spectacular. You know, you think of a city, and then there's a park in the middle of it, and just lined with skyscrapers alongside. So there you go. So yes, I have seen it. So yeah. So yeah, that was one. There was one argument which I thought was really bad. Let me find actually, where's that window one again? Because I've got pictures of portraits. So one of the arguments that people will say is controlled demolition. And the controlled demolition argument is ridiculous for simple logic. No, I haven't touched it. I didn't go into the city until after that. So, so the buildings themselves were fairly featureless. All you had was a couple of stripes on it, and that was it. Now, an aircraft altimeter, which tells you what the altitude is not terribly reliable. It's generally reliable, but it has something like a 30 feet positive, negative variation in tolerance. But of course, you know, a few feet here and there isn't a problem. It's when it, you know, the separation is normally 1,000 feet. So it's not that big a deal. And usually, you know, they're either using visual flight rules for landing, so you can see the ground, and their experience tells them the rest. So yeah, at low altitude, you can't tell what floor's what. So let's go with the controlled demolition system, okay? So to make it work, what you would have is you would have your explosives attached to the columns that you want to come down. And then you'd have wires which could go to a control box. And the control box would receive a radio signal, whether it's a mobile phone going off or whatever, which would then send the signal down the wire, make the explosives go off. Okay? Now, to make this work, you've got to crash a plane at a building at 500 miles an hour and crash it at the place where your explosives are laid. You know, if your explosives are laid here, and your plane crashes there, it's going to look wrong. If it starts to, you know, when it crumbles, it's going to look wrong. If your plane crashes here and the explosives are there, it's going to look wrong. So you need to crash your plane where your explosives are. So you've got to crash a plane at 500 miles an hour into a building where your explosives are laid, without damaging any wires, any explosives, and any control box. And you've got to have the area on fire for an hour without damaging any control boxes or wires or explosives. And then you've got to have a bit of one building land on another building, number 7, so that you can bring that building down by controlled demolition as well. You know, you can start a fire that brings down the other one. Well, this is now an uncontrolled demolition. If you want to do it properly, what you want to do is you plant your explosives, and you know, if you're nice, you say a bomb scare and people evacuate, and then you blow up your explosive, you know, and you bring the building down. Or if you're not nice, you just do it while there's people in it. And then you fabricate evidence to say whoever you want did it. If you want to go after Gaddafi, you say Gaddafi did it. If you want to go after Saddam, you say Saddam did it. You say Bin Laden did it. Whoever you like. You know, the Chinese did it. The Russians did it. Whoever you want to go after. You know, you can fabricate the evidence to do it. But no, it's ludicrous when you really think about it. So yeah, the arguments are just dreadful, and every single argument I've ever heard it usually has another layer of incredulity in it. I mean, there was one that there's two I can remember in particular that were really funny. So one of them was what about the 120-foot beam that was thrown 120 feet or 120 yards? And it's like, wait a second, 120 yards? I can't remember what it was now. But it was basically, they're talking about a single beam, steel beam, that was 3/4 of the length of the building. Well, how do you move something like that? I mean, you'd have to beam it in Star Trek style. But not only that, the distance from the World Trade Center area, it would have been over here to be thrown that far away. It's like, wait a second, you know, what about the steel beam that, you know, the really long steel beam that was blown there? No, it wasn't like that at all. Then there's aluminium planes can't penetrate steel buildings. Well, actually, yes, it's called kinetic energy. But not only that, the buildings weren't solid steel; they were waffle-shaped panels. If I show you, so this was the building. Let me see if we can find a. There we go. They're made out of waffle-shaped panels that bolted together. They've got big bolts at each end. That's what these holes are for, so you can bolt the pieces together. And you know, they slotted together like this. Can you see how they overlap each other and they kind of go on an angle? You know, and so you've got the struts that go across. So, like I say, all these panels, well, it's not hitting a solid steel building. It's hitting a waffle-shaped panel building. And, of course, the strain against, you know, these bolts just pushed right through. I think there were 3/4-inch bolts in them, several of them, you know. So it's not an impregnable solid chunk. But not only that, I bet that, there you go. There's, there, but there's, there is a picture of them lifting these panels on. I don't see it. Anyway, yeah, it doesn't matter. When where is it? There. So what was I saying? Oh, sorry, it was the New York thing, the picture I was looking at. Okay. So so it would have had to be thrown all the way over here, and it would have had to be super long. And it's like, yeah, but it wasn't even built like that. This is someone who has no idea about how the things were built. You know, they just spouted something, you know. But my absolute favorite one was someone made this claim that so let me show you this one. So okay, here's a perfect truth of video.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Okay, keyword here, details are sketchy. That's newspeak for unconfirmed report. We're waiting for the confirmation.
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off. And
just over a shoulder, there's World Trade Center 7 right there. And so they're like, oh, you see, the BBC are in on it. They knew about this stuff, you know. And the reality is, for this situation, was that so there are news groups out there. So you know, the BBC has one as a part of it. You've got Reuters. You've got oh god, what they're called. Oh, it's an American one. I can't think what they're called now. Anyway, so you got these news groups, and what happens is you can't have correspondents everywhere in the world. So they basically say, okay, something's happened. Do we need to send someone out to it? If we do, then they'll, you know, so they'll feed their information into the news groups, which will then get disseminated across the world to the various news organizations, whether it's Fox News or the BBC or, you know, some TV channel in Latvia or Japan or whatever. Okay. And then what will happen is the person in, you know, the TV station in Latvia, this is a big enough situation, they then send someone on an aeroplane or whatever, or someone who's already in America, because they'll probably have someone in Washington or New York, because, you know, those are places where things happen. Certainly Washington, D.C., because of all the political stuff. So they'll get in their car and they'll drive up there and they'll have the camera crew and they'll be speaking in Latvian and, you know, be saying like, oh, well, this, that, or the others happened. So, so that's how you get your correspondence on there. Now, if it's something in Bumsville, Idaho, and, you know, it's a, you know, it was a fairly significant thing, but nothing massively significant, then, you know, they just get, you know, our colleague with, you know, Bumville, Idaho News, you know, and so you got someone, you know, from some local TV station. So that's how they report it. Well, so what happened was in this incident was, and this is the way that Reuters and the BBC have explained it as well, was that Reuters put out that the World Trade Center 7 had collapsed. And what had actually happened was the fire department was saying that building's going to collapse. They pulled everyone out. They could hear creaking and, you know, things like that, the signs that, you know, it was going to collapse, or bits of it were going to fall off or whatever. And, you know, that they couldn't fight it because the water lines had been destroyed by, you know, the other World Trade Center 7 other World Trade Centers buildings collapsing. So the lines had, you know, the water lines had been severed, so they couldn't fight the fire by putting water on it because there wasn't any water to be putting on it. And, you know, and it had been hit by a building as well. And, you know, they couldn't go in it because he sent someone in it, and they'd already lost, you know, the fire department lost, what was it, 343 people, I think it was, you know, in the collapse that had already happened. So they didn't want to do that, and they're already on a salvage thing, trying to find if there's anyone in the other buildings. So they weren't touching it. And so the fire departments, you know, and they've even fired firemen on the ground saying, you know, watch that building, it's coming down. It was already out there. And I mean, I've created a hypothesis for this. I think that on a busy day, and, you know, it's a bit like, you know, when you're at school and the dining hall kind of thing, the canteen, whatever you want to call it, or, you know, at a bar, and people are talking, and then, you know, but the other people are talking loudly, so you got to raise your voice, and next thing you know, the whole place is just really loud. And maybe when you're at school, the teacher would go shh, and it would be quiet, and then gradually it would increase in loudness again. Well, you can imagine in the Reuters office, it's going to be the same. And someone overhears a conversation, you know, sort of like, you know, building number 7 is going to come down. Building 7 has come down. Yeah. And they didn't hear each other properly. And so off it goes on the feed. And so it was a cock-up. It was a cock-up. It wasn't a conspiracy. I mean, I don't know if anybody remembers that day, but when, you know, when the hijacking planes were still in the sky, the second plane had hit, the Pentagon had been hit. There's that fourth plane up there, United 93. That plane's still flying around. And they were, you know, people were saying there were up to 20 planes that had been hijacked at that time. The reality is they hadn't been hijacked, that, you know, only 4, and the others weren't listening to the radio enough or whatever. You know, they weren't expecting to be called. You know, they were flying from Chicago to, you know, LA or something, and they're, you know, sort of halfway across the Midwest. And, you know, they're not listening to the radio calls. So, you know, anyway, so basically it was a screw up. And unfortunately, as she was saying, details are sketchy, which is news speak for we'll wait. You know, it's unconfirmed. You know, and so with the demands of 24-hour news and on a busy day, and things get, you know, mistakes get made. This was a mistake, but the conspiracy theorists have jumped all over it. Well, I was going to say what my favorite one, and I love this one. It makes me laugh so much. So the BBC, the British, you know, broadcasting service, were in on it. So a foreign news agency was in on 9/11, and they leaked the information too soon. They should have leaked it an hour later, says this guy. And he said the reason why the BBC leaked it early was because the clock change. You know, the time zone, the clock change. And so I left a comment under it, and you'll find my comments under loads of these 9/11 Truther videos. So so you know, the reason why the BBC leaked it early was because the clock change. And I left a reply saying, bit of a problem. The clocks change in October. And the following day, you know, because this happens like over a day, you leave a comment and then the next day you wake up and there's a reply. And so they were insisting it was because of the clock change. And I was a bit snarky with them. I said, it's a nice conspiracy with only 2 problems. 1, the clocks change in October. And 2, the clocks change in October. Now, I know that strictly speaking, it's only 1 problem, but I thought it was such a big problem, it was worth mentioning twice. The following day, he changed the system. The reason why the BBC announced it early was because they were using European time. And I laughed. I laughed so much because the BBC News Centre in London, which was White City. Let me see if I can find it for you, because you'll appreciate it, I think. So this is the old, because they don't use it anymore. Not really, anyway. So this is the old BBC Television Centre, and it's a circular building. Wait a minute, is that television? Yes. No, I don't think it is, actually. Hang on. Let me check. Yes, yes, it is. I thought so. Yeah, it is. So BBC Television Centre was a circular based thing, and the newsroom was a circular room. And so, and what they had were they, if you imagine the circle, they had clocks all the way around it. So if you want to know what time it is in New York, you look over to your right and you see what time it is in New York. You look a little further over, it tells you what time it is in LA. You want to know what time it is in Singapore, you look over there. You want to know Australia, it's behind you over there. You know, things like that. So the BBC at 0 hours, you know, UK time, because Britain is the center of the world when it comes to time zones. Everything is either plus or minus it from Greenwich Mean Time. So, so the BBC at 0 hours GMT will use their New York office at will use European time at +1 hours to talk to their New York office at -5 hours in a room full of clocks. You know, and what I realized from this guy was never let facts get in the way of a good conspiracy. You know, he needed to move the goalpost to get his conspiracy to fit. You know, reality wasn't important. And that's the problem. You get people like that. And I see it so much with fundamentalists as well. It's not what they want to, it's not what is true, it's what they want to be true. And we all have to be careful of this. I mean, this is something for us to consider widely, especially in today's world where, you know, especially in America, where the political system is so polarized, and you've got, you know, sort of news organizations where, you know, MSNBC and CNN, like the, you know, Democratic propaganda channel, and Fox News is a Republican propaganda channel, that, you know, they can lie to you as much as they want under, you know, the First Amendment, you know, and just, you know, basically, you know, shine a torch up your ass, you know, to feed you, you know, treat you like a mushroom, keep you in the dark, and feed you on shit, you know, because in the American system, it's like, yeah, you know, the people who watch our channel want to be fed this stuff, so we're going to give them exactly what they want, because that will keep them watching and keep them, you know, buying stuff from the advertisers who are prepared to advertise with us and that kind of thing. It's a commercial system. It's a marketplace. In the UK, we have different systems as a part of their broadcasting charter. They're not allowed to lie. They have to represent a balanced view of things. And so, you know, I'll give you an example. Channel 4 News, which is my favorite news, to be honest. What they'll do is they'll have two guests on with different opinions. And the host, you know, the journalist, they will sort of ask them a question that challenges their position. And then they'll ask the other one, you know, challenging their position. So, you know, trying to get them to unveil what they think and what their viewpoint is on whatever issue they're talking about. You know, so like I say, that's, and they will sort of argue between each other, you know, so they're saying this, you know, isn't that a good point? Well, no, that kind of thing. They'll counteract each other, you know. This, so when you have articles in, you know, it's one of those dangers that we face. If you see an article on the web that says exactly what you want it to say, treat it with caution. You know, check up the source. If you've got, you know, 5 different sources saying something weird and wacky happened, and every single one of those sources cites one source, and it's not a sort of terribly reliable one, you think, yeah, maybe not. Maybe they've just jumped the gun and, you know, believed some bullshit. Whereas if it's something like, you know, the Manitoba police have said so-and-so, and here's the statement from them, and maybe even have them with a podium saying it, then you can say, okay, this is a bit more of a legitimate source, you know. So, you know, treat things with caution. We have to be very careful with that these days. I mean, you know, we only have to look at what's been happening. You know, if we look at what's been going on with Putin and the Koreans trying to seed dissension, because I don't know how many people realize this, but effectively we are going through another Cold War. It's not one that's been declared, but it's going on. I see this frequently with that Flight Radar 24 website, because back in the old days of the Cold War, the Russians used to send planes flying over towards NATO to challenge them. So let me share Google Earth for you again. So here's Russia, and we'll have planes, you know, Russian planes that take off here on the northern ports like Murmansk, And what they would do is they would fly over the top here, and they would fly over here into the Atlantic. And what they do is they use electronic intelligence, ELINT aircraft, to sort of listen in on the transmissions that are coming out. So whether it's radar tracks that are being, like they're targeting them and say, watching them, they're looking for weaknesses, they're looking for dips in power or whatever, ways that they can jam them, those signals. And so what will happen is you will get, a Russian plane or two, and they'll fly this way, and the Scandinavians, they will intercept them and monitor them, basically sit next to them and keep them out of the territory. Basically, they're in danger of being shot down if they end up drifting over, their territory. So they will, they will fly over the top of here, and then, and then we'll fly off. And what will happen is we have tanker planes that take off from here near Bryce Norton. So they will take off and they will fly, and they'll sometimes, do circuits. They'll just do rings round, round, and round, and round. And they'll do that for, several hours. And what will happen is the planes that are taking off from Lincolnshire at Marham or, somewhere like that, they will take off and they will fuel up because they'll take off quickly. They're on QRA, like 2 minutes, and the plane's running on the runway after the alert goes. So so they'll come off, they'll fuel up, and then they'll go up and monitor whoever's the danger, or they'll do the same up here at Kinloss, Lucas. So they'll take off here, and they'll be over here just doing circuits, and like I say, they'll fuel up and they'll monitor them until they get out of our territory, or near our territory. So, and that's how the system works. Well, after the Cold War, after Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a shift. And, they stopped doing it because they couldn't really afford it. But over the last sort of 6-8 years, they've been doing it again. And, and the thing you have to bear in mind, and I know I've talked for a long time. I hope people are still interested enough. I've got 19 viewers, so it suggests people interested. What you've got to bear in mind. So I'm going to go through some things that have been in recent history. So we know about the Crimea and how the Russians stole Crimea, which is this peninsula here. So the Russian territory finished there, and then and this all this bit of land here, you can see that's the Ukraine there. Okay, this red line shows the not proper. It's not a proper border. It's an illegal border. So this is Russia, and so one of the problems that Russia faced in the Cold War is that they don't have a warm water fleet. They don't have a warm water port. All their main ports are up here in the northern parts, and this is the reason why they had so many submarines. If you ever watch, something like The Hunt for Red October, which is actually a very good movie in terms of accuracy of these things, but when you watch a movie like that, it's all about submarines. The Russians had a big submarine fleet because they didn't have a warm water port. What they would do is they would use icebreakers to break the ice and then submerge and then, go in the Atlantic that way. And they would, sort of park them. The idea was they would park themselves off the coast of, of the US and fire ballistic missiles. Or they could fly them all the way from here. But of course, being in a submarine and close, the reaction time is reduced. And just take a drink. So they don't have any warm water ports on the north. The nearest one they've got is Vladivostok, which is down over here. But again, it gets iced up in the winter. So the only warm water port they had during the Soviet Union was down here on at Sevastopol, which is here, and it's the Black Sea fleet. Is that the right spot? Yeah. So the Black Sea fleet is here. So this is the Russian Navy's Black Sea fleet. Now, and over here as well. So what happened was, we have to understand this. We have to look at World War II. So, during World War II, the Germans invaded Poland, and there was an agreement with Russia, but the Germans, the Nazis, they didn't live up to it, and they invaded Russia, and they got into Stalingrad, and there was a big fight there, and gradually over time they were pushed back, and obviously the Allies were coming from the West, and eventually all culminated in in Berlin. And of course, it was going on across all this area here as well. And so all the territory, this kind of chunk here, that the Russians managed to secure from the Germans, they kept it. What they did was they put them, they created buffer states. So the idea, they got all these countries here, which were a buffer between the Western powers and Russia itself. So what they did was they put puppet government is probably not the best word for it, but not far off it. Effectively, friendly, Russian friendly governments. They supplanted them there, and if they tried stepping out of line, Czechoslovakia, for example, they would squash them, and brutally. So that was their way of maintaining control. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. The Russians couldn't keep this stuff. And the people who lived in these countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and Serbia and, so on, all these countries, Czechoslovakia was Czech Republic and Slovakia. So all these countries here, they couldn't rely on Russia anymore, whether it was with trade or militarily. So they gradually, over time, started to lean to where the money was, which was the West, the European powers, the European Union, and gradually over time they've been joining the EU, and not just joining the EU, but they've been joining NATO as well. Now Ukraine was a special one, and this feeds into all the Trump stuff as well, which is part of the reason why Trump. Why the Russians have been trying to help Trump, because Trump had a lot of stuff going on in Ukraine and similar places. So what happened was there was a government, and they were leaning towards Europe, and then there was an election, and during this time, even the guy that was going, for the European leading guy, he was poisoned. The guy went from, looking like he, having dark hair and, looking quite young still, being in his like 40s, kind of maybe 50s kind of an age, whatever. I can't remember how old he was, to looking like he was 65. His hair was grey. His face was kind of grey, and, his skin looked kind of awful. He went from being a young person to an old person because he got poisoned, by the Russians. Or at least that's I don't know whether it's ever been proven, but it's certainly been believed to be the case. But the guy was certainly poisoned. And so what happened was, eventually there was an election, and a Russian-leaning guy became the prime minister or the president. But the guy was really unpopular. And eventually there was a coup, and a public coup, really. And the guy was overthrown, and it went to another Western-leaning guy. And they were starting talking about joining NATO. Well, if they join NATO, what's going to happen with Sevastopol? What's going to happen with the Black Sea Fleet? Because they were still stationed there, even though it was a new nation. Effectively, it was an independent nation again. They had an agreement where they leased the port, they leased the land, and what the Russians were scared of was that if they join NATO, they're going to basically be told, "Sorry, the lease time is over. We're part of NATO now. Bye, go away." So so that was a problem. And so basically they stole it. They, seized it several years ago. Now, there's another aspect that comes into it. So why did Russia get involved with Syria? It makes no sense. They haven't really got much money. They've got sanctions. It doesn't make much sense. What would be the purpose? Well, one of the things to bear in mind is that to get from Sevastopol, from the warm water port of Sevastopol in the Black Sea, to get into the Mediterranean and then out either through Suez or out into the Atlantic via Gibraltar, the only way to get there is right through the middle of Istanbul, right through the Bosphorus, right through here, okay, right through the middle of Turkey. Well, Turkey is a NATO country. So, they could blockade the port to Russian vessels if they wanted, I suppose. I don't know. But they certainly can spy on anything coming out. So, back in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, the Russians had two warm water ports on the Mediterranean. One of them was in Egypt, and the other one was in Syria, at Latakia. And the Egyptians, they'd had a spate of little wars with Israel, and it's like, okay, we've decided that we're not going to be having these wars anymore. We're turning our back on that kind of stuff. We're now going to have a peaceful system. So, yes, we don't really like the idea of Israel, but we're going to do it by political means rather than military means. So we're not going to have any more of these, like, the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur war, things of that nature. So, so what they decide, so they signed an armistice. Effectively, they signed a peace agreement with Israel, and as a part of that peace agreement was, the Russians were to leave the port there, and then the second one was here we are in Latakia, which is this is where the Russians are now. So this is their air base, and if we look, we can zoom in. There's a cargo planes, and there's some fighter jets, some Su-24s, some Su-34s, which are fighter bombers, and a bunch of Su-25 sort of ground attack aircraft. There are some more Su-24s. Those are MiG-29s. And we've also got a few more up here, which possibly a QRA aircraft. So yeah, and then they're also in the port that's there as well. So there we are. That's not one. There doesn't seem to be anything here at the moment. Anyway, so they so getting involved gives them a warm water port, and they don't have to go through they don't have to worry about this Black Sea Fleet quite so much. And of course, it's not like a long way all the way around through the Bosphorus and so on. So So there's a couple of advantages for this. The first one is, they got a warm water port. The second one is that the Syrian Air Force is kind of shitty. It's got a few aircraft from the late 80s, maybe early 90s, but most of it is 1970s stuff. They don't have a modern Air Force at all. Now, one of the reasons why the Russians and the French refused to, go to war against Iraq in 2003 was because they had long-standing military investment with Iraq, that they were selling, Mirage fighters and Russian aircraft, as well. So they were, they had a lot of Russian and French military exports going there, and the Americans are the biggest trader, military arms traders in the world. The British and the French are close behind. You got the Chinese as well, and the Russians, but the Russians don't really sell that much compared to the Western NATO powers. So, and of course, not only that, you take something like, F-15s, American F-15s and British Typhoons and French Rafales. They all use the same frequency systems to communicate with each other with data. So, do you remember watching the end of the movie Independence Day, when they've got the screen and they're showing the different planes and how many how many missiles they've got left, kind of stuff, and when they're being knocked out? It's that kind of thing. You'll have an AWACS aircraft that's monitoring the system and listening, is getting feedback to and from all these individual fighters to say where they are, where they're going, what their ordnance is, and so on. They all work together because all the time there are these military exercises going on. 4 a year in America, there's one in France, there's one in Spain, there's one in Italy, there's a British one. They go in Australia and Singapore and all over the world. All these powers, allied, either NATO or allied to the US, and like South Korea, they have their exercises as well. So that, if a war happens, they're all sharing the workload rather than every single nation having to have, ISR, reconnaissance planes. And all of them having to have tankers, and all of them having to have fighters, and all of them having to have transports and things like that. They can share their resources. So, so you can have one tanker plane that's flying up, and it can refuel British or American or French or Italian or Spanish or whoever ones. So, so what happens is, Syrian Air Force is old. Thanks, Dan Drunk. So Syrian Air Force is getting old, and they're going to want to rebuild. If they manage to survive through this, which they're almost certainly going to now, thanks to the Russians helping, they're going to sell oil. They're going to and they're going to use that money to buy a modern military air force to protect themselves from, NATO countries or their enemy neighbors. So they're going to want to protect themselves. And Syria is a large place. You can see how big Syria is. It's large country. So who are they going to buy stuff from? Well, they're going to buy stuff from the Russians, aren't they? Because the Russians help them. The Russians are prepared to sell them stuff, whereas there might be sanctions from other countries. So like I say, they're going to do that. And excuse that ambulance going by. And an auxiliary benefit is that Russian pilots are now doing ground attack, combat missions. So they're actually getting training, effectively active, experience of, of military combat. Because one of the things to bear in mind, I mean, I grew up in the 80s. My parents were in the Air Force, so I grew up around military planes. And in the 80s, the amount of Americans, for example, that had actual combat experience were a few old guys that were left over from, still flying after Vietnam. There hadn't been any active stuff going on, no air-to-air combat, no, it wasn't until Gulf War One that, they finally, had an actual war, so it wasn't until 91, but from, the early 70s until 91, so 20 years, there hadn't been any proper, wars going on. So the amount of experience was incredibly limited. Well, between Gulf War One and the, the war on terror stuff, I mean, the only other people in the 80s that had any real combat experience were the British, because we had the Falklands War, and even then that was a minor skirmish that happened for about a month. So, there really wasn't much in the way of active combat experience. Now we have lots of pilots with combat experience. In fact, if there's any, if there's any limitation on it, it's that there's been a lot of flying over to places and dropping bombs on them, but neither Iraq nor Afghanistan nor the Libyans had any hadn't any planes good enough to actually defend the territory and have an air-to-air combat thing. So the amount of air-to-air combat pilots, active experience in air-to-air combat is rather limited compared to ground attack, where everybody, all the nations now have plenty of ground attack training. So, like I say, the Russian, and as I was mentioning earlier, you've got all these you've got all these exercises going on where they plan missions and things like that, so that if there's a war, they're all working together, singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were, in order to be as effective as possible, rather than all doing their own different things and overlapping each other. Let's do it properly, and let's do it as a team. Is basically it. They're team players. The Russians, by comparison, they don't have half as many hours of training, just normal flight training, let alone combat flight training. So this has given them some active combat training. It's given their military the ability to improve their weapon systems, improve the reliability of them, improve the reliability of tracking systems or radar systems, or or AWACS systems, or even networking between aircraft, so that they can communicate together, things of that nature. So all these elements all come together, and effectively we are now looking at another Cold War, because the Russians are actively trying to destabilize the EU. There's evidence that demonstrates that they have been, they tried to they interfered with, disinformation and things like that via Facebook and so on, against the Brexit vote, and also the Netherlands. They had an election that similar things have been happening there, and in Germany and in other countries, France. They've effectively been helping the right wing to become more powerful, because they want tension between America and Europe. They want look at how Trump has reacted towards Europe and NATO. This helps Putin, because Putin is old school. He comes from the KGB, and effectively Russia had no money. It declined for a while, and now it's working its way back up because they got oil and gas, and they're using it to improve their military. They've got stealth fighters now. They made orders for them. They've got an Su-57, it's called. The Chinese are making a stealth fighter as well. Even the Iranians are looking to make a stealth fighter. Whether they got the ability to do it, I don't know. So, the world is changing, and we are maybe not in one, but certainly it's slowly creeping up. Not a third world war, but another Cold War. Because the thing to bear in mind, if there was an actual third world war, if there was an actual war that started with Russia, Russia knows that it would be squashed, that they don't have the training, they don't have the military resources, they don't have the modern aircraft in the numbers that the Western powers do. So they would be squashed. They know this. And that's the reason why they have their nuclear arsenal. Because, if it came down to it, they would fire those missiles. They would fire it in a self-defense method. So what they're trying to do is destabilize, to break up the EU. They're trying to drive wedges in America, because if Americans are fighting amongst themselves under political idealism, then they're not worrying about what Russia's doing. They're not worrying about what China's doing. These are the things that we're faced with now, and these are things that we have to be very careful of when it comes to what news sources we read, what information has been given to us. Is that reliable, or is it so heavily biased that it's, are you able to disseminate what is actual fact from what is pseudo fact, from what is, heavily biased, by people who want to get into control? So, like I say, that's, I think I'm going to finish now. I think I've talked about a lot of things. I've talked about planes. I've talked about plane crashes. I've talked about how certain things work. And I'll tell you what, I'm just going to show you one last thing before I do. Because it is now 8:38 in the UK. And of course, we've got the planes coming in and out for Manchester. And so I thought you might be interested to see the planes coming in. So let's I'll do a screen share of that. Just give it a couple of minutes. And so this is Manchester right now. It looks like, yeah, there we go. So you can see this is a holding pattern, so it's done a loop. Oh, it looks like, actually, I think that may have done a missed approach. Yeah, I think I did. I think it went to land and then decided it was a bit too windy or something. Now, Manchester has the runway for Manchester. If I zoom in a bit, you can see the runways are this way. There's two of them, one there and one there. And what happens is most of the time, the wind comes this way off the Atlantic, comes as part of the jet stream. So normally the wind comes this way, but right now the wind is coming this way, if I remember correctly. So as a result, and planes always take off and land into the wind, because when you got the wind pushing against you, you get more lift. So so normally there's two ways planes come into Manchester. They either come from the south and they come this way and then fly in that way, or they come this way and then curve around this way and then come that way. I live on the east side here, so I see the planes coming in like that. But today they're coming in this way, so you can see this is a Lufthansa from Frankfurt to Manchester. They'll do that plane will do this all day long. And the nice thing is I can look out my window, see a plane. I mean, like, for example, let's have a look. No, it's gloomy and cloudy. So normally I'd be able to look out my window and see that plane there flying out the window. and you know, I can see there's the registration, and I can you know, put it in my little document to see whether I've seen it or not. And if I have, I'll mark it off. If not, I don't. But like I say, these are planes. So this one's taken off, and this one's going to Southend, which is sort of east of London. Southend is there. That's an ATR 72. Let's have a look. No, any more coming in? So nothing else coming in at the moment. But you can see all these planes that have landed or they're going to take off. These are ones that are ready to take off. This will probably be a Dublin. Oh no. I don't even know where my horn is. I don't know what that is. Oh, wait a minute. Did I say Mallorca? Menorca. Okay, it's one of the islands on the Mediterranean. This is one that's landed. Came from Cologne. Oh, that was one I flew on when I went to America. Where is it? Oh, that's the one. Sorry, that's the one from Vegas. The one we were talking about. I was showing you earlier. It's now landed, and it'll be taken off in a few hours' time. In 2 hours' time. You know, there's American Airlines one that's going to be taken off. Probably going to Philadelphia, which is the route it normally does with an A330. I know, I've been on them. Although it wasn't American Airlines, it was US Airways, which they bought out since. So, yeah, Manchester to Naples. Did I click on that one already? Yeah, got it. So, yeah, we can end up with a busy day. And, you know, you can, if I was to scroll down and look at Heathrow, which is over here, you can see this. This is the main airport. It's got 2 runways. There's a British Airways 747 just coming into land. It came from JFK, landing at Heathrow now. This is one. This is a Qantas A380 that's going to be leaving soon. This one should be a departure. Yeah, London to Amsterdam. Start off at Terminal 5, and is now going to be taken off. So that will. There we go. There is something that's funny to watch on these sometimes, because you'll get planes that moonwalk, so they'll end up sort of going backwards or something because the radar track isn't picking up the signal properly, or the transponder signal isn't picking up properly because it's at low altitude or something. So yeah, lots of funny little things you can get every now and again, and sometimes you get other little things that are of interest. The people behind this, they've got a Twitter feed, and I remember last Christmas time, there was an A380, Etihad A380, and it flew across Germany, and it basically did a Christmas tree. It just did a massive Christmas tree all the way over Germany. You know, doing sort of, so it'd do like a loop and then would fly down and then do a loop and fly in and do a loop, and, you know, so it looked like the baubles. And it was just a big, massive Christmas tree all over Germany, which was kind of cool. I've got it around somewhere, but I don't know where it is right now. So, yeah, like I say, it's a fun website to watch. And, you know, you can, if you live anywhere, you know, near an airport or planes flying above, if you look up and you see the contrail, you know, with a plane at the end of it, you can go on this website, let's say flightradar24.com, and you can scroll around to where you live, and you can say, and you can see what that plane is, where it's going, what its direction is, what its speed is. It's great fun to watch. I really enjoy watching these things. Now, I'm fortunate where I live, because living in Manchester, I've got this Lufthansa 747 here, an older one. Then it's a 400, so that's from the from like the early 90s. This is a Delta Airbus A330, formerly Northwest Airlines one. You can see 808 NW. So that will fly. I will see that flying off, and that's going down here for Amsterdam, which is over there. And obviously I get British Airways stuff going down to Heathrow. Air France, they'll be going down here for Paris. So all these planes fly right over my head on a daily basis. I get stuff coming from the Middle East area, so I get El Al, which is the Israeli airline. I get Etihad and Emirates. They fly over me as well, whether they're going to Dublin or whether they're going to the US. Another Delta Airlines one. And when the weather's really nice, I can actually see planes like this in the distance. So a Dreamliner over there. So yeah, I get to see planes up and down, backwards and forwards all the time. And it's great to see. So yeah. And not only that, actually, while I think about it, another reason this is good. So imagine you're at an airport and you're waiting for a friend. You're waiting for family, and you don't know when they're going to arrive. What you can Alexander, yeah, they actually did fly the route. Why do Delta still have MD-80s? Because they're not that old a plane. You're talking late 80s, early 90s. I think the last one was about 94, 95, something like that. And they've got 20, 25 years of lifespan in them. So why not just keep using them? They've got modern engines, so they're perfectly capable for what they do. So yeah. So anyway, so imagine I'm at Manchester and I'm waiting. Let me pick Manchester for a second. Let's do. Let's just pick this one from Portugal. So, oh, may not have taken off yet. Let's try this one, Istanbul. Okay, that's better. Show on map. Okay. So I got a member of, I'm going to be meeting my family who are coming. They've been to holiday to Istanbul. So I can look at this website. I know what flight they're on, which is TK1993, or, this one here. So I can, I can go on I can be at the airport with a tablet, and I can be looking at this website and know whether the plane has actually landed yet. Because you don't know whether they're going to be coming through the gate in 20 minutes or half an hour. You don't know if the plane's been delayed, until, and yes, it's delayed. Delayed by what? An hour? Half an hour? 20 minutes? 5 hours? Who knows? It's difficult for them to say. Well, you can actually be, you can be at the airport waiting, or you can be at home and you can say, okay, there's still another couple of hours yet before they're going to get here, so I don't have to worry. I've got another hour before I need to get in the car and go to the airport to pick them up, or you may be tidying up the house ready for them to come, so you've got another hour of tidying them before you have to go, or whatever. So you can be sat at the airport waiting, watching this plane you're waiting for arrive. I mean, I met Redline, I met Red Rhetoric at the airport, and I was watching his plane on this website. I knew where he was and whereabouts he would be, so I was ready for him when he got off the plane and I was waiting at the gate. The same was supposed to happen with Fiona, but there was a bit of a communication problem because I thought she was coming from Edinburgh, then going to London, and then from London direct to San Francisco. Instead, there was a delay. The plane was delayed, and they didn't think that she could make the transfer in London on time, so they put her on a flight that went to Philadelphia, no, Chicago, and then she flew from Chicago into San Francisco. And Red and I were waiting. He was sleeping because he hadn't had much sleep, so where I'm waiting at the gate, waiting for her to come through, the international place where you go through immigration and customs, and then you get to come through to landside, because there's airside and landside. So I can't go on the airside unless I'm flying, unless I've got the documents to go with it. So there I am waiting, and I've seen her plane come in and land on my tablet because they had Wi-Fi at the airport. So I've seen that happen, and it's like she hasn't got here yet. That's a bit irritating. So there I am waiting for like a couple of hours, and and I'm asking passengers, saying, people who've come through, said, have you come from through immigration? He said, yeah. I said, how long did it take? Were you in there long? And he went, oh, I don't know, about half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that. Okay, well, that now told me that something's wrong now. And then I woke up Red, and he said, well, she was supposed to be coming in from Chicago. Like, what? Yeah. Oh, okay, right. So her flight is going to be getting in so-and-so, so we'll wait there a bit longer. And then suddenly it dawned on me, wait a second. And she was only like maybe 20 minutes away. And I suddenly realized, wait a minute, if she's coming in from Chicago, then she'll have had to go through customs and immigration there, which means she's now going to be on a domestic flight. So being at the international terminal is not the place to be. So I ended up, having to try and figure out where she would be coming in, which terminal. At which point we then had to race across the airport, and unfortunately, there's a train system in there, and the inner one was broken. It was shut down for a while, and we ended up having to go all the way out of the airport to the car rental and car parking place, to come all the way back in just to go one station along. We had to go across all the way around the entire network just to go one station across. If I'd have known, we would have walked it if I'd have known how to do it. But so that was a problem. And by the time we got there, Fiona had arrived, gone through immigration, come out through the gate, and was having a cigarette outside. So that was kind of a bit annoying. But anyway. But like I say, it was quite nifty. It's a nifty website. It's useful for figuring out where you're going, where you need to be, stuff like that. So I'm going to finish now. My viewers have dropped a bit now, but hopefully this is giving insight on some things. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say. I hope I haven't bored you to tears. Maybe it's some background noise of me rattling on. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this. I can, if you wanted to join in a conversation another time, you'd be quite welcome. I'm a vast suppository of information when it comes to these kinds of things. That was a joke. So thank you very much, and have a great day, or a good night if you're going to bed. So take care.